So let's share the screen. Hi, good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Rabbi, gentlemen.
So yesterday we were learning that when you're a merchant and you're pouring out of your container to the customer, you have to, if you're a balabayas, then that you're only selling like from a boutique kind of store where it's not a busy store, like you're a balabayas. So then you have to take the extra time to pour out and let the stream of liquid cease, and then wait a few extra seconds for 3 drops to come out of your container. When you're a busy shopkeeper, you don't have to wait for the extra 3 drops. But if you feel bad about holding back from all of your customers because of the quickness of turnover, so then you can make a cheshbon at the end of the year and take that extra money that's accumulated from the 3 drops per customer and do public works with them. And that's sort of that's the guideline, is that whenever a person feels bad about having someone else's property and he doesn't know to whom he can make restitution, generally speaking, doing something for the tzibur, doing something for the communal needs, is not always the proper way to make restitution, but sometimes it's the only way to make restitution. And that's a guideline that will come up also in the laws of theft as well. Okay, the next halacha when it comes to weights and measures, and by the way, you'll see that at the end of the chapter, another important topic within this chapter is what's called hafka'as sha'arim, which is disrupting the I forget the technical term, which is artificially inflating commodity prices, which are essentials for the market, which are essentials for the society. So if you can't corner the market on certain essential products, and that's going to be where that'll be something that we'll see at the end of the simon as well. So it's weights and measures, and also market cornering. Okay, v'tzarich limdod ba'ayin yafeh sheyihiye odef al hamida. Another thing that a person is obligated to do, and it seems to me that this is probably only a rabbinical law. This is not, although it's based on a pasuk. But he says that you should always weigh with a generous eye, which means that even though your scales are 100% accurate, always add a little bit more to your customer. Just add a little bit extra. Shenamar, and how do we know this? Because the pasuk says, "Eifa shalema v'tzedek yihiyelach," that you should have a complete and righteous eifa measure. So, matamulomar v'tzedek. If you've already told me he's got to have a full measure, what are you adding with the word tzedek, a righteous measure? So, Amra Torah tzadek mishelcha. So the Torah is basically saying, tzadek, be virtuous with that which belongs to you. V'tein lo, and give him a little bit more. V'kama, and how much more above and beyond what the accurate measurement is do you give to the consumer? Shiaru chachamim echad mimeya b'midas halach, ve'echad me'arba meyos b'midas hayavesh. And the answer is 1% when it comes to wet goods, and 1/4% for dry goods. Lefi shahalach nidvak bedofnei hamida v'nishar lemochar, leficha chitzrichu bo odef gadol mehayavesh. And the reason why it's 1% for wet goods and 1/4% for dry goods, why is it 4 times more for wet goods? And the answer is because since already some of the measurement is being held back in the container of the seller, it's not all pouring out into the container of the buyer anyway, so that's the reason why you have to give them a little bit more. And the let's see, there is one Imrei Yaakov, which we'll take a look at over here. Wrote Salomar. So this idea that we learned from the pasuk that you should not only have a shalema measure, a complete measure, but also tzaddik, create righteous or virtue with your measurements. Wrote Salomar, Dechayev hamocher litain mishalo, which means clearly, even when I recognize that I'm not in any way, there's nothing to worry about an inaccuracy on the scale, I nevertheless have an obligation to give him a little bit more of mine. Levad hamishkal otosefis ma'at, give him just a little bit more. V'alfinan midichsiv even shalema vatzedek demiyusarhu lemedrash asya, da'afal pisha de she'efa shalema mandatata, b'cholzos tzadik mishalcha v'teina. Which is exactly what the Rav Shulchan Aruch said. He's just expanding on it. Basically, the Torah adds the extra word vatzedek, which teaches me that even though you've carefully measured out everything to the utmost of accuracy, you still have to give him a little bit more. And he says, accordingly, he's going to drink something. Ulefi zeh, ma shematzoi hayom, moznaim umishkalos elektroniyim. So he says, we have electronic scales today. Shema'agalim es hadavar bit shtaim v'shalosh gram, that many times the electronic scales will round off the measurement. And I don't know whether this is true today, or maybe it's only a few decades ago, but basically electronic scales will round things off to the closest, maybe is it a tenth of a gram or something like that, or maybe to the closest gram. Dahainu she'im shokel 58, 58, let's say for example, if something is 58 grams, it'll show you 60 grams. Av shaleka bazem mishum lo sasu avel b'mishpat bishum dehiskimu al ze b'nei osa here kimavor b'sif aleph. So it could be that you're only giving the customer 58 grams of something, and the scale says that it's 60 because it rounds it off to the closest 10. He says there's nothing wrong with that, technically, because that's the convention. In other words, everyone agrees that at some point a scale cannot be 100% accurate because it rounds off, it approximates when it gets down to the very, very small. Like if a guy buys something in kilos, right, you're buying a commodity in kilograms, then it'll round it off perhaps to the closest either gram or to the closest 10 grams. But it's not going to round it off to a fraction of a gram. And so the point is that we all know that the convention is that it's rounded off, let's say, to the closest 10 grams. So mikol makom tzarich b'sikum lahorid mehamachir ma'at kidei lakayin tzadek mishalcha. But nevertheless, based on this, it's important that if you're giving someone exactly the amount, knock off a few pennies off the price so that you're giving the person a little bit more than what he deserves. So when you're doing accurate measurements and it's not practical to add on some extra goods, then knock off a few pennies off the price. But either way, it's always proper to give the benefit to the consumer, just by a very small amount. Okay. Next. I'm just deliberating whether we should go through all of this. Well, I'll tell you. Let's read it, and you'll tell me if you find this to be of value, and if not, we'll continue. A lot of these laws pertain to commercial trade before the 20th century. So, if you were watching a Western on late night TV, which doesn't really exist anymore, but you're watching a Western, and a guy goes into the dry goods store where Mr. I forget the guy's name, and you'd say Well, I need 10 pounds of flour. And then, he'd weigh it out for you on the scale, and then you'd throw a bag of money, a nondescript bag of money on the table of jingles. Yeah. And then you'd walk out with your 10 pounds of flour, and they'd weigh it for you on a balance scale. But that was the convention of the entire world until the 20th century. So, but a lot of these halachas pertain to the old westerns, but they don't really have that real application. But let's see what he says. V'tzarach limdod k'minhag hamedina v'lo yish. You have to weigh using the convention of where you live, of the society, of the community. Even though you may feel that you have a right to change, you don't have a right to change. So, for example, he says, "Makom shenagu limdod b'mida daka kagon log, lo yimdod b'mida gasa kagon revias hahin." He says, if the minhag is to measure out wet goods with a smaller measuring cup, then you should not say, well, I'll use a larger measuring instrument like a revius. And mipnei, and what's the reason? Mipnei shebazeh yesh hefsid lokeach, because you're causing a loss to the consumer. Ki afsha ha'odef hu lefi erech hamida mikol makom I efshel etzamtzem v'tzarich limdod berevach kol log v'log shahaya b'chol echad odef kishiur bevadai. He says, because when you use a smaller measuring cup, every time you measure, you're adding a little bit more, like we said in the previous if. So the seller could say, I'm perfectly willing to add a little bit more to the larger measuring cup, and I'll do that. But it's not good, because by using the smaller measuring cup, each time you're using the smaller measuring cup, you're adding a little bit more for the consumer. And here, if you're using a larger measuring cup, you're only adding a little bit more one time instead of multiple times. V'yesh bazeh revach lelokeach yoser mishim dod lo b'mida gasa v'yitain lo odef echad lekulam. Okay, so that's the first rule. U'makom shenagu limdod b'mida gasa lo yimdod hamodid hamamuna bi'ir b'mida daka. He says, and conversely, if the convention is to use a larger measuring instrument, then you're not allowed to. The person who's in charge of telling merchants how to measure should not change the standard and make the measuring unit smaller, mipnei hefsid hamocher, because that would cause additional losses to the sellers. If the sellers are used to a particular standard, you're not allowed to change the standard. Malkam shenagu ligdosh lo yimchok afilu beratzon halokeach. He says, if the minhag is when you sell dry goods, you always sell it a heaping measure, then no one has permission to, what's the opposite of heaping? Level? Is that what it's called? You don't have a right to level off the goods. Afilu beratzon halokeach. Even if the buyer is agreeable to this, shapoches lo damim, because the seller says, I'll sell it to you by level measure instead of heaping measure, and I'll give you a discount. No, you're not allowed to do that. You have to stick with the convention of the city. Umakom shenagu limchok lo yigdosh afilu beratzon hamocher shemosif lo damin. And conversely, if the standard of the city is always to level off the dry goods when it's measured, then the buyer and the seller cannot collude together that I'll pay you a little bit extra, just give me a heaping measure. Why? Ki haTorah hikpida al ivos hamidos penteitze takola al yedezeh. The Torah is concerned that there should be uniformity in the way people measure, even if two people, a buyer and a seller, privately agree that they'll depart from the convention. That's not okay, and the reason is because the Torah is concerned about the communal standards being upheld, because if not, something corrupt may eventually ensue. Sheyira haroda shemodedin kain, the yimdod lo shekachi midas hayir, the yimdod kain la'acher she'enu yodea gam kain haminhag v'yate'elu. And the concern is like this. Let's say I'm a merchant, and the convention is always to sell by heaping measure. And I see my fellow merchants down the block I see that he's leveled off the measure, not realizing that he's reduced the price for the customer because of that. And I'll say to myself, well, if he can do it, I can do it, and I'll charge the same amount like that everyone else is charging, and I won't give a discount to the buyer. And essentially what's going to happen is that people are going to, it's like a game of telephone. That's why the rabbis were very, very careful when they instituted the laws of weights and measures, and they said, even if what you're doing is perfectly fair to the person across the table, you need to abide by the communal standards regardless of, because it's because of the appearances. You have to make sure that other people are not going to misinterpret what you're doing, not realizing that you've made a private deal with the person that you're transacting with. Okay. Another halacha in Ches is ein osin hamachak midala'as mipnei shuhu kal ve'eno nichnas kol kach b'mida v'ra l'mocher. When the convention is to level off the measure, when you sell it to the buyer, you should use a leveling instrument that is of medium weight and of medium density. So what do we mean by that? So a leveling instrument is basically like a ruler, right? A yardstick, something like that. So don't use a yardstick that's made out of pumpkin skin, like a very, very soft material. And the reason is because of its softness, it's not going to level off correctly, and it'll create loss for the seller. V'lo shel matechas mipnei shu kaved v'ra l'lokech, and it shouldn't be extra heavy, like made out of metal, because then it's going to level off too much, and it'll create more loss for the buyer. Ela b'shel mishel egos v'shikma v'ashachroa v'chayotzi b'hem me'itzim shehim beinonim b'mishkalam. But rather you should use wood, a nut wood or a sycamore, or I think achroa is balsa, and different kinds of wood that are temperate in their weight, and in this way you're leveling off the measure in a temperate way. Ve'ein osin oso mitzad echad avo mitzad echad katzar, mipnei sheha'av eino nichnas kol kach batavua kekatzar. And you also have to make both edges of the leveling instrument the same width. And the reason is because if one is a wide width and the other edge is a narrow width, what's going to happen is that a thick leveling instrument, when you're leveling off, let's say, wheat, small kernels, is not going to level off as well as something that has a pointy edge. V'shema yimchok b'tzad ha'av k'shekona v'tzad ha'katzar k'shemoche. And therefore it could be used interchangeably. Like when I'm the buyer, I'll use the thick edge, and when I'm the seller, I'll use the narrow edge. And Eliyasa shnei tzidov avin o shneim kitzarim kefi haminan. So rather, what you have to do is that the leveling instrument has to be made in a uniform way, both edges being the same width, and it has to be conforming to the standards of the community. V'lo yimchok ma'at ma'at mipnei shehu mochek harbi u'mafsid l'lokeach, v'lo b'vas achas mipnei shehu mafsid l'mocher, el b'pam echas b'masam. Don't level off intermittently, like very, very slowly, and then stop every couple of inches, because that's leveling off too much, and it causes a loss to the buyer. Don't level off too quickly, because that causes a loss to the seller, but level off in a temperate way. All in one motion, but it should be done slowly. Okay. Next, Tess. Do you find these of interest? These old methods of measuring. These are all recorded by the Gemara. Next, Tess. Hasiton shekona mine machal umashke umocher lechen v'ni harbe biyachad. A ceton is a wholesaler. He purchases agricultural products from the farmers, and then he sells them to merchants that are going to sell retail. Okay, that's what a ceton is. he purchases all different kinds of agricultural goods for consumption. He sells them to a vendor, sells them to a retailer, and he sells them. He buys and sells in large quantities. So tzarech lekaneach midas halach echad l'lamed yom b'shvil shenikbatz behem hayayin v'hashemen v'nikrash b'socham u'misma'etes hamida. So a wholesaler has to clean his measuring utensils once every 30 days. He says because since he sells in such large quantities, there's very quickly there could be an accumulation of residue on the inside of his containers, which will cause the measurements to be off if he's measuring by volume. Okay, so especially with wet, we were talking here about wet measuring cups. Ve'achen v'nishuhu mocher ma'at ma'at u'mocher tadir yoser mehasiton tzarech lekaneach midos of pa'amayim b'shavua. A retailer has to clean his measuring utensils even more frequently because he sells in small quantities, but he sells to more customers. And therefore, he has to clean his measuring utensils twice a week. So a wholesaler cleans his measuring utensils once every 30 days, and a chenveni, a retailer, has to clean his measuring utensils twice a week. So that's 8 times as frequently. She'ein sarich lahatif gimel tipin machmas shehu mocher tadir, and therefore nikrash besocham yoser. He says, and remember, because we said that a chenveni, a retailer who has a busy store, doesn't have to spill out those 3 drops to each customer. And so therefore there's a greater amount of accumulation of residue on the inside of his utensils, which could harden over a very short period of time. Ubalabayas hamocher shelo she'eno mocher tader kolkach kahasiton v'lo nidbak v'nikrash kolkach b'midosav dai lo she'yikanchan echad liyud beis chodesh. If a person is a balabayas, he's a private seller, and like we said before, he sells in small quantities but infrequently, so he doesn't sell as frequently as a wholesaler, and certainly doesn't sell as frequently as a retailer, and so therefore there's not as much of accumulation of residue in his containers, so he only has to wipe, and he takes more time to pour out the 3 drops for each customer that he does have, and so therefore he only has to clean the inside of his measuring cups, his measuring utensils, once a year. He doesn't have to do more than that. Okay? Next, Yud. Hamishkolos osin osam litra v'chatzi litra v'vriya litra avolo yasa litra v'lo chamishis litra v'lo shalosh v'vias litra mipnei sheyicholim litos bahem. The size of the weights, you remember you went to science lab and they had those balance scales, and in the balance scales you had these golden weights that were based on 100 grams, 50 grams, 10 grams. Did anyone ever do that in the lab?
It's too long ago, Rabbi. Can't remember.
Can't remember. So that was the convention, is that you had different sizes of weights, and they were measured on it. You measured it on a balance scale, and that's how you would weigh. You would sell by weight. So there are standard sizes. There's the litra. We'll call that the kilo. Okay. There's the chatzi litra. There's the quarter litra, and those are standards. So therefore, a person should not make a third of a litra, or a fifth of a litra, or 3/4 of a litra. And the reason is because even though you could argue, well, I'm just giving more options to my customers, but since the convention is for the society not to be familiar with those measures, people could be deceived into thinking that they're a different weight than what they really are. And therefore you have to always abide by what the community is, the communal standards, what people are familiar with. Okay, Yud Aleph. And we'll finish with this one. Ein osin mishkalos ela mitzachiach sela o mizechuches. You should make what should be the material that you make these weights out of. either from tzachiach sela, which is a certain kind of quarried rock, which basically means that you quarry, or from glass. But you shouldn't make your weights from metal. Why? So he says, Yesh meforshim hatam mipnei shemalin chaluda umischasrin behemshech hazman. Some say because they corrode over the time, they develop rust, and metal is corrosive, and they therefore get smaller and smaller over time. And that's why you can't use them at all to weigh out anything for any kind of good that you're selling. V'yesh omrim shelo asru ela b'mishkal sheshoklim bo basar v'chayotze bo midvarim sheish behem lachos v'nidvak b'matachos u'misyavesh. There are others who say that the only thing that's prohibited is you can use metal weights, but only when, let's say, you're measuring things that create residue, such as meat. If you're a butcher and you measure meat on the balance scale, so what happens is that sometimes the fat clings to the weight, and it dries on the weight, umachbid, and it makes the weight heavier than it really is. And that's how you're going to cheat the consumer, is that you're going to make him think that he's buying a kilo, when really the scale, the weight is really I'm sorry, no, that's going to give the benefit to the buyer and not the seller. But based on that, if you were going to be weighing a dry good that doesn't cling at all to the metal, then it would be okay. And that's our minhag. Our minhag is to allow metal weights, provided that you're weighing things that the goods itself do not cling or adhere to the weight. Umikol makom mishkolos ketana sheshoklim ba'kesav v'zahav imishil mateches tzarech lechafosa bo'or v'chayotze bo. However, if you have very small weights, like those gram or 10-gram weights, because you're measuring out very precious commodities like gold and silver, when you use a metal weight, you should cover it in leather or any other kind of protective cloak that will be added to the weight. And the reason is because since metal can sometimes wear down over the course of time. Just think about coins that lose their face over the course of time, right? Because of handling with the fingers, he says that could cause great loss because you're measuring very, very small amounts. However, when it comes to other dry goods that are not precious commodities, the rabbis were not as concerned about the corrosion of the metal, and therefore it's okay. All right? Questions, comments? All right, so we'll hold it here.
Square, Rabbi. Take care, gentlemen. Be well, everyone.
Have a good day, everybody. See you tomorrow. By the way, tomorrow is Shir. Friday we won't have Shir because of a lot of stuff, a very long slichas morning, okay? All right.